Hey Fred, this doesn't need to turn into a fight over the definition of the word evolution. It's kind of silly. But I do think that you probably know that Darwin didn't want to use this word to describe his theory of speciation because of the philosophical baggage that was attached to it. The word had been used long before Darwin came along. Um, but putting that aside for a minute, let's just talk about consciousness. You said at the beginning of your video that we don't really have a working definition that everyone can agree on. Um, I don't think we can talk about consciousness being a thing. However, I think later in your video you rightly point out that it's a process, and because of that, that's precisely why I think we have to talk about it uh, in an evolutionary context. It's an evolving process. Um, I don't think we can reduce it to the brain, though, and say that because the brain has remained anatomically, physiologically identical for the last 150,000 years or what have you, that therefore consciousness hasn't changed and evolved. Because consciousness evolves not through replication but through recognition. Um, and sort of the complexification happens as self-consciousness becomes um, more and more a factor. Um, so we're not dealing with a Darwinian process here, where there's just random mutation and then selection by an environment. And we're certainly not dealing with a process where consciousness is trying to increase its fitness to a pre-given environment. Um, as I didn't exactly mention it in my video on Jean Gebser, but the evolution of consciousness implies that both the subject and the object um, are transformed through each mutation of consciousness. So um, we're not dealing so much with a biological, physical process. We're dealing with a reorientation in time and space of the human being. So, to speak of consciousness fitting something which is external to it is to neglect the fact that for us as conscious beings, the objects of our attention are always inside of our consciousness. And so when consciousness changes, so do the appearances of objects, or what would be an external world which we're supposed to be fitting to. Um, so that's important to keep in mind. Now, when we speak of Darwin's theory, I think it's more appropriate to call it a theory of speciation, not a theory of evolution, because I don't think that random mutation, and that part is random as far as Darwin was concerned. I don't think random mutation alone, even given natural selection, can account for the trend towards complexity that we see in the last 4 billion years of evolution in the biosphere. Um, I know that you mentioned, for example, the Red Queen strategy, where predators and prey engage in competition and in that way increase their complexity to keep up with one another. But of course, animals are rather new on the scene. Maybe the last 500, 600 million years since the Cambrian explosion. Prior to that, we're dealing with very simple organisms, mostly single-celled organisms. Or maybe for the first 2.5 billion years, we're dealing with only single-celled, very simple organisms, which we now know share genes horizontally. So there's no competition going on there, and yet there's still this process of complexification through symbiogenesis, which Lynn Margulis speaks a lot about. And we're discovering more and more that this process of horizontal gene transfer takes place even with more complex animals. Whole segments of the genome have been found to be transferred between different species. So rather than a Darwinian vertical picture of gene transfer, we're getting the sense that genes have been shared by the all kingdoms of life since the beginning, since the origin of life. So that changes our understanding, and we can no longer rely on competition to explain complexity. Um, you know, Developmental systems theory points to the fact that complexity, that changes in the traits of organisms may happen as there are certain spatial and temporal changes in the development. So the genes can remain the same, but as um, an organism is growing, certain layers of skin fold in a different way, perhaps because they grew slightly slower, maybe something in the environment changed to cause this, and out of that comes an entirely new species. And certainly with complexity theory, people like Stuart Kauffman and Brian Goodwin, Peter Corning, Peter, I think that's his first name, they're discovering that matter has this tendency to order itself spontaneously without the need for some sort of natural selection process to take place. And so I think it's incorrect to say that Darwin's mechanism is the only naturalistic hope we have for accounting for complexity, because I don't even think it does, but there are all these other approaches in biology, these other paradigms, which can help us account for complexity. But putting that aside, maybe we don't have to call this an evolution of consciousness. I would be happy if we were just able to recognize that consciousness has been transforming and mutating throughout the course of human history and prehistory, because the historical era is precisely a mutation in human consciousness, where all of a sudden we recognize different features of the world that hadn't been apparent to us before. And I think even to describe it as I just did, not to make this too much of an idealistic theory, but as I said, when consciousness mutates, both the subject and the object of experience change. So our sense of what the world is and our sense of who we are is transformed through each of these mutations. So I want to keep this relatively short, and I'll post a link to John Gebser's Wikipedia article so that you can get a better sense for what I mean by mutation and so on. So yeah, hopefully that clears up where I'm coming from. Thanks for listening.